Right, so today is the 17th of April, and I'm standing here in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Stellenbosch's boardroom. It's set up as a classroom at the moment because we teach some of our graduate classes in here. All of the lecturers and staff in the Faculty of Theology, the professors and lecturers, they have their pictures there. You'll recognize that guy, that's me. Tazake Kezula, my friend Retief Nadine, Henry Mbaya, Dr. Weber, Dr. Nell, and the rest of our colleagues. So all of them are on the walls here in the Faculty of Theology. And this is normally where we would have our faculty board meetings and special gatherings for the university staff. So today I'm going to be recording the very first question and answers of this vlog. It's not a lecture, it's just a thought. And I thought this would be a great place to record it amongst my colleagues here, church historians like Dr. Miller, biblical scholars like Dr. Kezula and Dr. Nell, practical theologians like Dr. Bowers de Toy and Dr. Weber. And the good news is, because this is not a lecture, just a thought, I don't have to cover all of those topics in depth. I'm just going to give you some personal theological opinions and point you to one or two things that there are for reading. So I got a number of questions from people on Facebook and Twitter. So I thought I'd share those with you today. I've got them here on my phone, and so we'll see where we start. So the first question that came in was from Peter Craddock. And Peter Craddock said, "Hi Dion, I'd love to hear how this discourse could be moved to a more sustainable and transparent mission to churches." He's talking about the vlog about inequality that I did. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. He says, "We're in the process of planting a church and have been disillusioned by the superficial and shallow input from churches to date." So I guess he's talking about how does one plant a church that begins with a notion of Christian justice right from the beginning and a false sense of recognition that they give themselves. How do we get justice and compassion right from an integration point of both dynamics and logistics? Now, let me say, Peter, that's an incredibly good question. Thank you for that. It's very thought-provoking. I've given it a lot of thought. And I think perhaps, for me, one of the central issues that I can think about is if one begins your understanding of being church right from the beginning by understanding that you're partnering with God to achieve the things that God wants to do within the community where you find yourself, where you're planting this community of grace and care, of good news. So there are a number of very good sources. Perhaps two of the best resources that I can suggest that you look at are, first of all, Scott McKnight's two books. The first one's called The Community Called Atonement, and the second one I think is called The Cruciform Church. If it's not right, I'll fix it in the show notes. But these two books are wonderful because they help us to understand what a Christian community should look like that has the understanding of worshiping God, caring for humanity, dealing with issues of the self, my own personal sin and my understanding of my need for transformation and renewal, but also in dealing with others. So those would be some good resources to look at right from the start. And of course, I don't know too much about church planting, but certainly I would hope that whatever you do in your church honors God through worship and teaching, but also through discipleship, through training people, to teach it, to supporting them to become faithful as disciples of Christ. And of course, I hope also that you would be engaged in the work of evangelism, so bringing good news to others, but also, of course, understanding that the gospel, the whole gospel, has not only to do with what the good news sounds like, but also helps people to experience what does the good news feel like? What does the gospel community look like and feel like? So let me just say, if there are others who are watching the vlog and you're a missiologist or a church planter, maybe you're someone who's well-schooled like my friend Jaco Buerta, in issues of justice. My friend Alan's story. Why don't you share some ideas for Peter here? So Peter, thanks for that question. I think it's a great one. Right, so this next picture is a picture of Professor Alna Mouton. She was the first woman dean of the Faculty of Theology here at Stellenbosch. She's a wonderful New Testament scholar and an expert in Christian spirituality, very, very fluent in isiXhosa. Started her career, actually, I believe, as a missionary, and then through further training eventually came into the academy. And she's had quite a wonderful impact on my life, not only as a scholar, but also just as a wonderful example of a Christian person in the academy. Now, here's another question, and this question comes from Chris Berner. Chris spent a year with us here in South Africa, and I got to meet him during that year. Chris is from Duke University. I think he did his graduate work at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. I spent some time there as well. And Chris asked this question. He says, I have a question for your vlog. Do you think the church has failed the victims of apartheid in reconciliation and reparations in what South Africa is in post-apartheid? Also, how does this parallel the current LGBTQI battle in your country via the church? So maybe, Chris, I can deal with the two issues here. So the notion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this process that took place in South Africa in the mid to late 1990s is a contested issue at present, and it's contested in politics and in theology. You see, the principle there is that some people are saying that all that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did was that it silenced the pain of South Africa's black majority. So the evils of apartheid that were perpetrated not only during apartheid history, but through colonial history that preceded that for hundreds of years, since settlers came to occupy land and space and politics and thought here in Africa, that the undoing of that was not given enough credence in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, of course, the TRC itself had a very specific period that it was meant to cover, and very sort of specific guidelines for what it was to do. Mainly, it had to do with crimes that were of a political nature that were perpetrated during the lead up to the apartheid era and the apartheid era itself. But the issue is that there has been some contention that, in fact, there wasn't enough truth in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that the form of forgiveness that was offered was a kind of forgiveness that in some senses re-empowered the perpetrator but didn't do enough for the victim. And that's where Chris's question about reparations comes in. We haven't seen a transfer of some of the most important aspects of the evil of apartheid into the hands of those who were abused and disempowered. So that has to do with land, with economic transfer in the country, with access to social and political power. So we haven't seen that happening as fully as it should. So there are very many people who say, in fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission failed. Now, that's one view. The other view, of course, is that it was a very important tool, in a sense, a very important process in the history of South Africa that allowed us to move from an incredibly conflict-ridden, broken and painful period of South Africa's history into the possibility of the kind of South Africa that we have today. So for many people, they say that in some sort of liturgical sense, almost we could say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was important because it allowed for the possibility for people to speak truth and for the victims of the perpetrators to be able to take agency for themselves, to say that we are no longer your victims. We have the right to forgive or not to forgive you, and to place that forgiveness over them. Now, the second part of Chris's question has to do with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, with this sort of challenge that we have in the church in South Africa. Now, what you may know is that South Africa is still a very largely religious country. In the last little bit of research, which I'll stick in the show notes that I did, 83% of South Africans indicated that they were either Christian or belonged to one of the major faith traditions. So that's a very high percentage. In the World Values Survey, it was shown that religious institutions still have the highest measure of trust from citizens, more so than the government or the private sector. But one of the challenges that we have in South Africa is that we also have a conservative theological outlook amongst our population, and that's informed in some ways by culture and by the way in which people use the Christian scriptures. And so what we're finding in churches in South Africa and in religious communities is that the intersection of culture and conservative theology is incredibly oppressive to persons who have a same-sex orientation. Exclusionary, sometimes even to use Nelson's categories, it's a punitive, rejective. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. We'll do a vlog on this one day. But not only rejecting people who have a same-sex orientation, even punishing them. And if we were to draw a line of continuum between the kind of truth and reconciliation of the TRC and what we see happening in our communities today, Chris, I think we would have to say that the church is not really getting it right. We're excluding people. We're not creating space for the voices of those on the margins to be heard clearly. And I think in some senses there's a stronger commitment to what the gospel may sound like and not a strong enough commitment to what the gospel of Christ may look like for all people. So that's not a complete answer, and I'd love to have your feedback. You're working on this, I think, in a doctoral project. And so, yeah, do send me some feedback. Let us know some of what you're discovering and thinking, and we'd love to share it here on the vlog. So thanks for the question, Chris.